And I'm joined here with my fellow council members. Up first, we have the 2022 to 2027 Parks and Open Space Plan, and we have Terry Jungman presenting.
All right, thanks for having me. Terry Jungman, Park Planning and Development Manager. Thanks, council members, for having me here tonight. Our department is ecstatic to bring forward our final presentation on the Parks and Open Space Plan. This really constitutes a year plus worth of work on behalf of a lot of different people. I'm just the talking head who gets the opportunity to come up here and preach about this plan and how important it is to our department, but really it represents a lot of work on behalf of our consultant group. I want to shout out Stephanie Worrell, who's done a tremendous amount of work on this plan, staff, and really, I know it's kind of cheesy to say, but really is a reflection of what we heard from the community. So this is really the community's plan, and we're really grateful for all the input that we received through this process. Before I get too deep into the presentation, I also wanted to recognize some members from the school district who have come in support of this plan tonight. So we've got David, Wade, and Brian who are there in the audience. We'll be talking a little bit more about why they're here a little bit later in the plan, but I know some of them have to duck out at various moments, so I just wanted to recognize that they're here tonight and thank them for all their help in kind of pushing some of these things forward. So, kind of a reminder on process and where we are. This is a graphic that kind of shows the overall timeline for the plan in some distinct phases. We did a lot of information collection, engagement, a reminder of some of the data statistics behind our engagement. At this point, after our public comment period, which just wrapped up last Friday, we now have over 3,000 touch points with the community, so we're really proud of that number and really doing an earnest public engagement effort as part of the plan. We've done a ton of geospatial mapping, heat mapping. We've done a full inventory of all of our assets in GIS, so that's really given a great baseline set of data to be looking at and doing further analysis from. And then that kind of brings us to where we are today and the things that we're going to be talking about today that are new that you haven't seen before. So over here, we're in this sort of reporting and final engagement phase, exiting the engagement with that public comment period wrapping up. So some new things that we'll be talking about today are benchmarking, level of service, kind of looking back at what we did within the 2016 plan, recreational value, performance-based level of service, and now talking about traditional level of service. We'll do a little bit of a refresh on geospatial mapping, going to talk nature score, athletic capacity study, and then taking all of that information, all that analysis, and then kind of how it gets wrapped into our strategic project list and how we prioritize. Once we've got that list, we'll talk how do we implement this? How do we make these things happen? Funding and O&M, and then we'll close out with some next steps on this plan. The plan's kind of broken up into some sections that are who we are. We kind of covered that in the last presentation. What is this demographics of our city? Who is our population? Who are the people that we serve? What are our parks? This really starts to talk about where we are going and how do we get there. So we'll start with some look at benchmarking. We're going to come back to this graphic a few different times through the presentation. But what we have here is the city of Kent is on the left-hand side. You've got the metric in the center, and then how we are benchmarking ourselves is utilizing NRPA data. So the NRPA data set that we're looking at is the 2021 National Agency Performance Review. The reason why we chose this data set is it represents a much broader set of data that we didn't bring into the 2016 plan. In the 2016 plan, we kind of benchmarked ourselves against some other cities in the kind of South Puget Sound region. But we thought with this plan, that was great for that plan, but now let's broaden our horizon. Let's look a little bit further and other cities across the nation of a similar size. So it puts us into this upper quartile of population. So we're looking at cities that are in the population range of 100,000 to 250,000. So we kind of fall within that range, and we feel that it's a pretty good comparison for the purposes of this plan. So the first metric we're going to talk about is this top one, which was acres of parkland per 1,000 residents. City of Kent on the left side has 7.81 acres, and on the right we have the NRPA benchmark, which says 15.9 acres. So this is a metric that is looking at the availability of parkland in our city as it relates to our population. So going back to the 2016 plan, we established really what was kind of an innovative approach to how to plan and develop a park system. That's the performance measure that you see on the bottom, a performance-based level of service metric. So a reminder of what that is, it looks at the recreational value of a park, which is really the quality and the quantity of amenities combined, and then dividing that recreational value score by the population to come up with that metric. Using this approach to level of service really emphasizes reinvestment, maintenance of our existing assets, and some development, and really does not consider acquisition as a primary driver of decision making. With this plan, we said, that's great. We're going to keep that because that's really fundamental to how we have built out our park system over the last 6 years. But now let's add a layer of analysis to that. So that's where the traditional level of service comes in. And the reason why this is important, again, we're going to get into this a little bit deeper into the presentation, but you have to have both. You have to both look at your existing assets, making sort of maximally using your parks, your existing parkland, but you're also going to need to acquire new parkland if you ever intend to keep pace with population growth, right? These sort of have to work hand in hand as a two-part strategy to get us to where we're keeping pace with the growing city. So, looking at level of service over time, we've got some columns here, 2016, 2021, 26, 31, 36. So just kind of looking at a trend over the next 20 years. We've projected out population of roughly 1% to 2% increase over each year. And then we're looking at the recreational value and the acreage within those years. Now, the recreational value is looked at assuming that we're able to make roughly a gain of about 25 points every 5 years. And this is kind of based on what we were able to do from the last plan cycle. So it's a pretty good guess. I think we could probably do a little bit more of that because we were kind of getting up and running, but it's a conservative look at how much recreational value you could increase over time. Whereas the acreage is static. You're going to notice that we make some gains and some losses actually. So if we look back at parkland over time, we've actually lost some parkland, Cronish Park, the YMCA parcel, so our total acreage has actually gone down since 2016. But then beyond that, as we look out in projection, because we have no stable acquisition program within our department, there's no dedicated funding for acquisition, we're assuming that our acreage is going to stay the same. So when you look at that, traditional LOS, which is, again, acres per thousand, that number goes down over time because our population is increasing, right? So we're going to perform poorly in that metric because we don't have a dedicated funding source for acquisition. Performance-based LOS has some gains. They're marginal, but they're not huge. So it goes out 1.62, 2.06, 212, so on and so forth. The reason for that is whatever gains you make in terms of recreational value are sort of cut by the fact that population is continuing to increase, right? So we're able to make some amount of gain, but it's limited in terms of what impact it can have on the overall system of assets. And I think that's an important takeaway from this graphic. A couple of examples of gains in recreational value. West Fenwick, one of our favorite projects that we've been working on over the last few years. In 2016, it had a recreational value of 7.4. With the project that we completed in 2021, it now has a 17.5 recreational value currently. Still a little bit of work out there that we could do, so there's a jump of about another 4 points that we could make in recreational value to get to its full potential. But 17.5 is a great score. That actually does a ton for the West Hill, especially when you look at all the geospatial mapping that we've done. So really close to reaching the potential at West Fenwick. Comparatively, let's look at Clark Lake. Clark Lake has a current recreational value. In 2016, it was 2.3. We've made some really small gains out there, some reinvestment, addressing failing infrastructure, things of that nature. It's brought us up to 3.4, but clearly hasn't reached its full potential of 26, right? Clark Lake is one of the biggest recreational value scores that we have in our system and would really have a massive impact on the access to quality recreation on the East Hill. So this is just kind of an example of where we're reaching or close to reaching our potential and where we're not even close to reaching our potential because we haven't really addressed the project there. So let's look at LOS by city region because I think this is a really important piece. Not all regions are the same. Yeah, I see a question.
Go ahead.
Was that mine?
Yep.
Okay. Terry, a question on that last slide. How do you measure the recreational value of a park that's developed with play equipment like Fenwick versus Clark Lake, which is more the left to be the natural? Does that impact those scores differently?
Yeah, so the recreational value methodology is based on the assets within that park, and then there's overall park condition multiplier. So Lake Fenwick, being more of a natural resource, is likely not to have as high of a top end in terms of recreational value as a place like West Fenwick. But there are other things that drive that score too. Things like number of miles of trail, whether it has a loop trail, whether it has interesting features or placemaking elements. And so that drives some of the scoring as well. So I think Lake Fenwick, because of its overall acreage and how much capacity it has, actually does end up scoring pretty high. Probably not as high as West Fenwick, but comparatively, it still is a pretty high scoring and a high tier project or park within our system.
Thank you.
And I should have said this at the beginning. I have a lot of information to cover, and so I would ask that if we could just hold questions until the end. I'm going to try and cruise through this and leave time at the end for us to actually address all of the questions. So thank you for that. So LOS by city region. So looking at these two metrics, the traditional LOS, performance-based LOS, how do these break out within the regions? Because not all regions of the city are the same. So some takeaways from this. The West Hill is quite rich in parkland. I don't know that we all realize that, but the fact that it has 11.61 acres per thousand is higher than both East Hill North and East Hill South. I think what this points us to is we need to maximize the use of parkland on the West Hill. There are some key strategic acquisitions that need to be made, but we actually have good parkland. We just need to make better use of it up there. I think it points to the fact that East Hill North is the lowest scoring by acreage. I think we kind of intuitively know that there needs to be some acquisition strategy up on the East Hill North, even with the parcels that we have. If you look down at the potential recreational value, we're pretty low. So looking at these metrics is starting to point at some strategies for each of these regions, with each region being dealt with a little bit differently. Downtown and the Green River region, pretty high in terms of acreage. Downtown, very low in its current recreational value, but has a high potential. So we have good parkland downtown, but we need to make better use of it. We need high quality and quantity amenities at these sites. Kind of similar story with Green River, although it performs a little bit better. So I think this really kind of tells a story of how the strategy for reinvestment, acquisition, and development really needs to be tailored to each of the regions of the city in a slightly different way, with some overlap between them. And just as a point of reference, what is a good measure in terms of potential performance or potential recreational value per thousand? I think kind of what we're looking for in these populated areas is kind of a score of around 4 feels right. So we want to try and get all of these scores up to a 4, with East Hill North being kind of the lowest performer in that range. So the reason why we did the mapping that we did is because it actually combines a performance-based level of service with a traditional level of service model. So what we see with our heat mapping on the right-hand side is actually those metrics combined into one geospatial map that allows you to do that analysis in kind of one space. So just a reminder of what is in the layers that build these park need maps. We have population density by zone, so that's what this represents. Access to transit is scored within that. Racial and social equity, which includes race and ethnicity, socioeconomics, and health metrics. And then the walk sheds, which is both a 10 and a 15-minute walk, with the scores being sort of appropriate to that 10 and 15-minute walk. So all of this data kind of results in these maps, this is the park need by current recreational value, and then the park need by potential recreational value. Now, I'm not going to make you squint to try and figure out what this says. We'll take you to the next slide, which actually zooms in on some of these locations. So what this points to is a bit of an acquisition strategy. Again, no surprise, East Hill North has some key areas that are highlighted in yellow. Just as a reminder of the legend, the scale here, yellow is very high need. It's the highest score in terms of need. These are places in the city that desperately need better access to recreation. Purple is low need, meaning they have good access to recreation. So East Hill North has some key locations which we need to look at, better utilization of parkland and potentially acquisition strategies. East Hill South, there is good availability of parkland, but we see pockets of yellow popping up, and that has primarily to do with low-value recreation at each of these sites. So some of the locations that we're kind of looking at there, this is where we have 272nd. It's an undeveloped park. It's an open space, but there's major barriers to developing that, both in terms of capital development costs and O&M. Pine Tree, we all kind of understand the story of Pine Tree, and it's sort of underperforming and not reaching its full potential. Tudor Square is in that mix too. So we need to really look at a reinvestment strategy for this location. And then the West Hill, the Midway area, this is kind of a site that we know Density is coming. We're kind of anticipating that density, and we have absolutely no parkland up there to serve the people who are going to live there. So it really points to a very specific and targeted need for acquisition on the West Hill. Okay. Transitioning out of park need and level of service discussion and now talking about nature score. Looking back at our survey results, we had three big emphasis that came out of the survey of what the public told us that they really want out of our park system. Access to trails, access to nature, and public gathering. Two of those are really kind of closely tied together with access to trails and access to nature. And so we've kind of highlighted those metrics here where these performed, these top priority investment areas where the performance was really high: nature trails, paved walking and biking trails, natural areas and wildlife habitat, access to water, and then regional trails. This is something I'm pretty passionate about, and it's actually pretty well documented. Access to nature is pretty well documented by Richard Louv in his book Last Child in the Woods. Nature deficit disorder is a real thing that's being tracked now, and it's the definition of nature deficit disorder is human beings are spending less time in nature, resulting in a wide range of behavioral problems. When you look at the health benefits of access to nature, it's linked to improved attention, lower stress, better mood, outdoor physical activity is increased, boosted immune system, lower blood pressure. You go on with the benefits of having access to nature. And so, with all these things kind of being combined and hearing what we heard through the survey process, it's really pointing us to a new metric that needs to be tracked within the department. So hence, we present to you the nature score. Now, it's not fully baked. We really didn't have time to get into it as deeply as we wanted to in this plan because we were trying to do a lot of different things at once. But what we wanted to do is tee up the concept within the Parks and Open Space Plan and then carry it forward in implementation in the next 6 years. So the idea is that we want to go through and systematically map the nature value of each of our parks. Now, not all of them actually have a nature value in that sense, but we want to map all the sites that have a nature value and then start to look at areas of the city that are deficient in access to nature so that we can with precision, look to invest in areas and look at acquisitions to help improve that score, that access to nature score across the city. So right now we're breaking it into three tiers. The first tier is parks that have a highest natural resource and habitat potential. These are places like Clark Lake Park, Lake Fenwick Park, Mill Creek Canyon, GRNRA. These are the big sites. Those within a tier 2 would be parks that have smaller natural areas. They tend to have some potential for habitat and are connected to green corridors. And then those in 3 kind of have the lowest nature score. They are usually not tied to a contiguous green corridor. We're going to be fleshing out the system as we move forward, but I just kind of wanted to set up the framework here for this discussion today. The next steps as it relates to nature scores, if we really are going to move forward with a true a nature score system, we need to have a dedicated budget for natural resource management, and we're going to need to update all of our scores and tie it to some geospatial mapping. So that was nature score. Now let's talk about athletic capacity study. This was kind of a standalone report within the Parks and Open Space Plan that's getting wrapped into it. Again, coming back to our benchmarking data and keying in on these 3 figures. So we're looking at soccer fields, baseball fields, and softball fields. You can see we're performing really well on softball fields. We have 6 fields. The NRPA benchmark says we really only need about 5 based on our population size. We do okay on baseball fields. There's some gains we can make there, but the biggest imbalance is on soccer fields, that horizontal field space that we know we so desperately need. So let's look at this data in a little bit more detail. As part of the consultant-led effort, we looked at all of our reservation data. We looked at the availability of our facilities, and the things that we found was that in adult soccer, we have 538 reservations, and we only have 3 fields. And so when you look at the other metrics, 215 reservations for adult baseball with 2 fields, and then 521 reservations with 6 fields for adult softball. Now, this only represents the permit. It does not represent the number of users. That's not data that we have in our system. So this is, again, just the number of instances of programmed events that are happening within these spaces. So I think the big takeaway from this is when you look at this data, where we really need to be making focused investment is in our horizontal field space and really maximizing the use of the field space that we have. For adult soccer, we had 179 reservations per field per year, and we have the least number of soccer fields out of any athletic field in our system. So we have to really think about where we're going to be making investments to kind of flip that availability of facilities and availability of resources. How do we get there? How do we solve this problem of athletic capacity and reaching our capacity? So kind of what we found is that we've essentially reached our capacity within our existing facilities. There are some gains that we can make. It's not to say that there's nothing that we can do. There are things that we can do, and we'll talk about those in a second, but we're limited in terms of how much capacity our current system has. Without some big acquisition, it's not really going to move the needle in a significant way. Cue to the school district. That's why they're here tonight, because we really see the path forward on athletic facilities for the city as a partnership with the school district. That is our way to build in more capacity within our system. But kind of talking about some of the strategic moves that we can make, we need to continue to make conversions from natural grass to synthetic. There are some sites where we can do that. Hogan has space where we can do that. KMP is one. We have lots of kind of questions that need to be answered around the KMP site in terms of cost. Looking at converting smaller fields into youth sports to get more out of those spaces. Anytime we have one use where it's singularly baseball and there's space to fit in a horizontal field, we need to be doing overlays similar to what we did at Hogan 1. That's been a tremendous success in terms of number of reservable hours and the amount of function and utility that we get out of that space. We need to upgrade our lighting systems throughout. I think a lot of our system is kind of old technology. We need to upgrade all of that to LED. There's energy efficiency, operational efficiency through automating the controls that will really help benefit some of that. And we really need to work on the school partnership. There's a big missed opportunity by not really kind of developing that into a formal partnership where we're working together on things like joint used facilities, having shared space, because in most of the instances, their use hours are opposite from ours. So there's clearly an opportunity for us to start to layer our use hours together to find the right mix that makes sense for both of our users. There's going to be big O&M efficiencies gained through that process. And again, I just want to thank our school district for kind of stepping through this process with us and being there along the way as we talk about the athletic capacity. They've been great partners. They've been some of our biggest cheerleaders in terms of moving this process forward. And so we really feel like we have their support to continue this conversation, and once this plan is adopted, to take it to the next step and start working through sort of the nuts and bolts of how that actually happens. So I kind of talked about a lot of these projects, but field conversions at Hogan, KMP, Service Club, these are kind of dependent upon some long-term trends, and they really need to be tracked because the cost of doing synthetic turf conversions is getting really high, and we need to be really careful about how we invest those dollars. Lighting upgrades, and then we've kind of looked at some sites where some of these school partnerships might make the most sense. Right now we're thinking about Meridian Middle School, where we have North Meridian Park. Those two are kind of paired together. Kent Meridian High School with Campus Park nearby, and then Kent Ridge High School. And so we've kind of had some preliminary discussions about these being some of the first sites we may start talking about, but there's a lot of work to come on that front. And then the last one I just wanted to mention is, opportunistic land acquisitions will always be part of the equation to solve this problem. It's very, very unlikely because of the rising cost of land and the cost of development, but one thing we are looking at that needs a little bit more time to be fully baked is potentially looking at the landfill on the West Hill for some reuse of that space for natural grass athletic fields. But more to come on that in the future. So this is a ton of analysis. We've done a lot of work. It looked at various things, and it's we've arrived at our strategic projects, and we've done our best to take all these bits and pieces to try and wrap them into some succinct goals and outcomes that are tied to those goals. So the system here is you've got your goals at the top with the colors associated with them, and then each of the outcomes below with the sort of colored brackets around them that tells you which goal that outcome ties back to. So I'm just going to kind of read through the goals really quick because I think it's important. And this is just excerpts directly from the plan. So transparency and communication, we aim to create easily accessible information about the park system, build constituent trust, and be transparent in our decision-making process to share how projects are identified. Physical access for all, we aim to create a system that has easy access to parks from home and work. To do this, studies of street infrastructure, density, racial, and social indices, park access points, and transit routes were incorporated into database mapping. Diversity of high-quality amenity, we aim to create a system that provides high-quality amenities that reflect the diversity of Kent. Public engagement identified which amenities are needed, not needed in the system, and providing guidance on where those amenities are needed. And then system resiliency, we aim to create a resilient, sustainable park system, funding partnerships, operations and maintenance are all key components to ensuring the system provides high-functioning amenities with a budget that can be sustained. So this all rolls into an actual scoring of the projects. This is our scoring methodology. They have a point system. I'm not going to go into detail here because it's too much to talk about, but if you're curious about it, I'd be happy to talk you through it. But basically, each of these gets a score, and then it is tied to a complexity cost score as well. And then that results in sort of a ranking of these from near, mid, to long term. What does that mean? What does near, mid, and long term mean? Near term projects are projects that are in progress, so these are ones that are funded, and they're top projects for the next 6-year budget cycle. Midterm projects are not currently funded, but are good candidates for a future funding cycle, so sort of in the near term, trying to find funding for these projects. And then long-term projects are ones that are currently funded and are not currently funded and have significant barriers to implementation. For example, it would be we don't have O&M funding to support the development or expansion of that facility. We don't have funding for acquisition, so on and so forth. So there's major barriers to moving those projects forward that need to be overcome before we can really get to them. I don't want this list to scare anybody that if your project falls into a mid or long term that we're never going to do it. The list is fluid. It's meant to be that way. This is really just sort of an organizing methodology to start to look at projects and start discussions about them. It is very likely that this list is going to change over the next 6 years. Projects are going to go from mid to near, long to mid, as it's a dynamic system. Things change, and so we're going to need to be dynamic and adjust to that. But we needed a system to start to organize ourselves around this. So this is what it is. So this is, we're going to have a sheet for each region. I'm not going to talk about every project. I'm just going to kind of quickly go through and highlight some of the projects that we've got here because we do still need to talk about funding and O&M. But for the West Hill, these are projects that we're moving forward with. Salter Vista is a project, actually, I'll be coming back to you tonight to talk about this project for its bid. Some of the other projects we wanted to mention, this is actually one that came in through the West Hill Cambridge the Evergreen Middle School partnership, so there's a big potential there, another partnering opportunity. And then another one I would highlight is the Midway Neighborhood Park. So this would be sort of that highlighted area that we've got right here where we really need to make a strategic investment in parkland. Downtown region, 4th and Willis, obviously we've got a great project there that we're wrapping up over the next month. Kerosene Park, that's another big construction project that we've got teed up for this summer. Master planning going on at Earthworks and Mill Creek Canyon. Some in the midterm, Riverview Park, this is one that's really closely tied with all the levee work and Signature Point. So those are two projects that we've kind of got in the midterm that they're a few years out still. And then one we got that I want to point out is Hogan Park being in the long term. The only reason that it's really in the long term right now is availability of capital funding to promote that development and the increased O&M that's going to be triggered when we start to convert those fields. Green River region. So the projects here that I would call out, Van Doren's Landing, that's wrapping up this summer, a really important project for really all regions of the city because it's truly a destination for the city. But some other projects, Briscoe Park, that's one that, not a lot of investment, but could actually do a lot more for us in our system. Green River Natural Resource Area, that's one we've kind of put in the long term as we really start to kind of work out our partnership and a different model with Public Works about how that facility could be managed differently. East Hill South region, kind of calling us back to this here, some of the projects that would help move the needle on that deficiency area that we've got highlighted in the map, the 272nd Park and 132nd. These are projects that are in the long term again because they're capital development projects. These are new parks. They don't exist today. It would be new assets. And without additional O&M to support those projects, it's difficult to move them forward. So just kind of highlighting that. But projects that we do have moving forward, Springwood Park, major renovation, major funding associated with that project. And then the other one I would call out is Clark Lake. We saw from the slides earlier about the potential recreational value that can be reached at Clark Lake Park. East Hill North region, a lot of work to be done here. The project list isn't long, but again, that's primarily driven by the fact that we really need an acquisition program up there to kind of fill in some gaps. But some progress that's going to be made over the next couple of years with East Hill North Community Park, aka the Hughes property. North Meridian kind of jumped up into the near term because of some of the equity scoring associated with that project. And that is all for that. Sorry, I am flying so fast. There's a lot to cover. So we got a lot of projects. It's a wide range of projects from capital reinvestment, system expansion, new capital development. How do we get there? How do we fund all this work? And how do we deal with the operation and maintenance concerns associated with that? Well, we have 3 graphs. What I would really have you follow on these graphs is the recreational value trend. And it's not tied to any real data sources, but I think this is a really accurate representation of what actually happens when you make certain funding decisions around a parks department. So if you fund capital funding and you fund O&M proportionally to the work that's being done, recreational value will go up in relationship to population. So this is a healthy system, one that's able to keep pace with ongoing deterioration of the system, but that's also able to build new and anticipate population growth. So this assumes that you've funded both capital and O&M adequately. What happens if you underfund O&M? Well, you're able to make some initial gains in terms of recreational value. It'll go up initially, but as you don't invest in things like preventative maintenance, restrooms will start to close, we won't be able to get to daily servicing as often, parks are not going to be as clean and safe, and use is going to go down, and so recreational value is going to go down. So if you underfund O&M, gains initially, rec value goes down over time. And what happens if you underfund capital? We know the story too well because we addressed it in the 2016 plan. But recreational value just kind of holds this static line. No big gains, small marginal increases over time, but no real big changes to the system. So we really want this over here on the left. We want to not only fund capital, but also fund O&M. These are some numbers associated with, I think, what the project list represents in terms of capital funding need. So currently we're bringing in roughly $6 million of new capital, not new capital, of capital funding every year. So $6 million in our capital budget each year. In order to keep pace with reinvestment needs, and this is just sort of failing infrastructure, addressing system deterioration, we need roughly $6.5–7 million. We've done a full asset inventory and projected out what those needs would be over time. And it says we need to keep pace with that, we need to invest roughly $7 million per year. So that says an additional $1 million of capital reinvestment needed to keep pace with that. We're really close, but we're not quite there. To do any of the capital development, this would be all the new projects, the parks that don't exist today, we would need to invest roughly $60 million over the next 20 years to address all of those projects. So that says to do capital development, we need $3 million per year. So the total need for capital funding to address all the projects that we have within this plan, every strategic project, we would need an additional $4 million per year to be able to do that. Now, this does not assume any acquisition. Again, that is a separate need and is not addressed through this because we don't have a dedicated acquisition program. Let's now transition to O&M. So if we were to do all of the strategic projects in this plan, our current O&M funding is $7 million per year. To implement all of the proposed projects and utilizing existing properties, we would need an increase in the O&M budget of $3 million per year is needed. So spread over 20 years, we would need an increase of approximately $300,000 every other year, and that equates to roughly 1 FTE with each budget cycle. So again, $300,000 every other year or 1 FTE. This is what it would take for us to keep pace with all the stuff that we've proposed, all the projects that we've talked about in this plan. This is the data behind that. So when we look at it, what would happen over time with all the projects that we would do, we have 6 parks that are in a maintenance LOS A, 21 that are in a B, 24 that are in a C. As we do these projects, what we're going to see is more of those rise into an LOS A. When we put more projects into an LOSA, when we build nice things, when we build highly successful facilities, the use of those facilities goes up. So things like daily servicing go up. West Fenwick is a perfect example where this has happened. We're a victim of our own success. We've built a great project, a great park, and now people are out there using it all the time, and it's putting an additional strain on all of our O&M that's responsible for maintaining that park. So we need to anticipate as we move forward into future years with all the projects that we're putting out there and the improvements that we're making, that we're proportionally funding the O&M along with the capital. So not to belabor that point, but in order to fund these things, we really don't see an opportunity to do this anymore with funding that we have currently. We really don't see an opportunity to make any more gains within funding sources that are currently established within the city. The way we see this happening is we're going to have to go to some voter-approved measure. That's really the step forward. We've kind of maxed out what we can get with our existing capital through REIT and B&O and the general fund. If we're going to make gains, we're going to have to go for some voter-approved measures. So that would mean a levy or parks district. We've kind of looked at the numbers on what this would be. generally speaking, a park levy, you're able to assess up to $1.09 and generate $29 million of maximum revenue from that. That's roughly $511 per year to homeowners. Park district, maximally what you could do, 75 cents generates roughly $20 million. That's $350 per year to homeowners. I kind of think what we're saying is like, for every quarter of levy or park district that you generate, that would be $6 million per year, or $116.75 per year to homeowners. So we've kind of worked out what we think this would be, and we think that it's viable, but this needs more analysis, more discussion. This is really just sort of a bookmark that we need to come back and talk to council about this again before anything moves forward, but just wanted to tee up this conversation for the future. Okay, wrapping up. What are the next steps as part of this process? We've got a long list of things that we've said we need to do. One of the things I'm excited about is rolling out the story map. I'm going to try and show it here in just a second. It looks like I've got a few minutes to do that. The story map is going to be sort of the Reader's Digest version of the plan, and it's going to live online for the next 6 years until we do the next plan. So this 100-page document with a 300-page appendix that really is not approachable to anybody except for me is going to be in a much more digestible format online, and so we're really excited to share that. Moving forward with asset management, part of what we learned in doing all the analysis and research on the O&M and the funding side is that we need more data, and so launching asset management as a department is the way that we can do that and have a higher level of sophistication in the O&M data that we gather. Additional funding for operating and capital budget, we just talked about that. That's going to need to be a really key if we plan to execute all the projects in this plan. Moving forward with Nature Score, we really didn't spend a lot of time updating goals and policies in this plan. It's really mostly a carry forward from the last plan. We did that intentionally because department-wide we want to update all of our policies and goals across the department, so there's going to be a bigger effort in the next year kind of looking at the system-wide policies for the department. We just extended an offer on our GIS position. We're really excited to get that person going. Moving forward in earnest with a partnership with the Kent School District, I think this is something that we start to do immediately. We kind of already have started doing that, and we want to really push this ahead because that's going to be really key in terms of building out not just athletic facilities, but also looking at shared use space for things like playgrounds and gymnasiums and so on and so forth. It really opens up a whole new world for us for system capacity. The park strategic framework plan is something that Julie's been talking a lot about. It's essentially the roll-up of all the individual divisional plans up into an overall department plan. That's going to be really important, and actually there's a really groovy graphic within the plan that kind of helps conceptualize how all these plans to relate to one another. So if you're curious about what that is, I would go and take a look at that. And then all of this is really part of an effort ultimately to get to CAPRA accreditation, which I think is a really important step for us as a department. Date-wise, we have the Land Use and Planning Board public hearing next Monday, so May 23rd we have a public hearing for this. We'll be coming to Parks Committee on June 2nd. ECDC as part of the comp plan amendment process on June 13th, and then final adoption at council on June 21st. I'm out of breath. I'm going to open up for comments from there. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate it. Oh, actually, can I do a quick, Kim, can you transfer to the web browser for me? Oh, actually, yeah, if you just hit escape, then I can.
Really quick, Terry.
Yeah.
Really quick.
So this is the story map. It's going to live online. Like I said, it's going to be a condensed version of everything that's in this plan in a very much more digestible format. The heat mapping is going to be on here. The full project list is going to be on here so people can actually go into an interactive map, find their neighborhood, and find the closest project and understand what that means. So we don't have to spend a lot of time on it. It's forthcoming, but I just wanted to share that. So I'll stop there.
Whew. Thank you so much, Terry. Before we get into questions and comments, I want to thank the Kent School District representatives that are here. As you can see, we have a need for increased capacity, so I really appreciate you working with our Parks Department. As you can see, our community needs it, so thank you for being here. And then I want to thank the park staff. I see Terry and Carrie and Brian and Julie and Dave and Garen and Lori. I know this is a full, it takes a whole department and it's a lot of work, but I think we should be really proud of it. I especially should be proud of the the heat mapping and the story maps and all that GIS work. So thank you. All right, now questions from anyone? No? Okay. Thank you so much, Terry.
It's a lot.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. We have a budget discussion with Paula Painter.
All right. Well, good afternoon, Council Member Michaud, other council members, and that didn't kind of roll off the tongue very well, and also Mayor Ralph. You know, it seems like since I've been back at the city, we've had a lot of discussion about budget. And that discussion really started well before I was here. In fact, I know there was a lot of discussion as you guys navigated the fiscal cliff. Figuring out what to do with when all of those revenue sources that were covering our ongoing expenses, when they left, what were you going to do, and coming up with a great plan for that. And then shortly after I came back to the city, the pandemic hit, and we were going through this budget reduction exercise that trying to prepare for what is this going to mean to our budget. And then we all of a sudden, with the pandemic, there was stimulus money that came out. So we had another opportunity to talk about how are we going to spend the CARES funding and how are we going to spend that ARPA funding. In addition to all of that, we had also all the regular budget process discussions that we've had. So I really believe that we've spent so much time talking about budget and so much time preparing and so much time looking for a plan for our future. And, you know, when we start thinking about the 2023-24 budget, if you recall, back when we did the reductions back in the spring of 2020, our initial goal was to make sure that when we hit this 2023-24 budget, we were in a good spot. And that we were ready for this budget, and it was going to be, I'm going to use the word easy sailing, because that's what I would have liked to have seen going into this budget cycle. But, you know, with all of that, we were hit with something that really we weren't expecting, and that is inflation. And I've put a snip up here of what inflation is looking like. If you look at June of 2021, our CPI number was 6.3%. The June number is what we use when we start working on our next year's budget. That is really the platform that much of our information is going off of. And, you know, back in 2008, we had seen a CPI of 6.2% in June. But guess what? That number was down to 1% by the end of the year. So we weren't seeing this growth that we're seeing now. We have continued to see this CPI grow to 7.8% to 8.1%, and I just received in May, the middle of May, this 8.5 figure for April. What we don't know as we're going into this 2023-24 number is what that June number will be. And me, I'm really hopeful, and I really want to be optimistic that it's not going to be that high. But you know, I can't come here and say that. And looking at the trend that we're looking at now, it's really hard to tell. An 8.5% CPI is big. It is tied to our salaries and benefits. It is tied to many of our contracts. So this is something that's really going to be playing into our 2023-24 budget that we really weren't expecting back, our 2023-24 budget that we weren't expecting back in 2020. So I want to spend just a little bit of time just kind of walking you through some of these things that are coming up with this budget, and then kind of our game plan for getting through it. We know, as you guys know very well, we have settled the KPOA contract, so that one is now known. We do know what that's going to cost us, so we can easily budget that. But there are other personnel costs that are really unknown to us. AFSCME and Teamsters union contracts, those are up for negotiation this year. We don't know what is going to come from that. But no matter what comes from that, we also know that there is some sort of tie between our CPI number and what ends up happening with those contracts. There's also a tie with the CPI number and what ends up happening with the KPOA contract, or the contract's negotiated, but the KPOA pay. In addition to that, we are doing a non-represented study, salary survey, looking at those individuals that do not belong to one of these three unions here. The KPOA contract, we mostly know it. What we don't know is what CPI is going to be, and that's going to be the driving factor truly in what the ultimate costs are. But the other three items, we don't have a lot of information to go off of other than we do know it's going to cost us some money as we go into this next budget process. So when we start looking at that inflation number, we know we have some expenditures out there. Well, what's going to pay for this? Well, what's going to pay for it are these general fund revenues, at least when we're looking at the general fund. And 25% of our general fund is property tax. Property tax is capped at 1% growth plus new construction. So if we're looking at CPI of 8.5% right now, and we have $32 million or 25% of our general fund revenue capped at 1%, we can already know that right here we have an issue. And we do know right now, which is great, that sales tax and utility tax and B&O tax, they've been doing wonderful. They have been kind of moving along, growing at better rates than actually we have anticipated, which has been wonderful, but that still isn't enough to offset what's going on with property taxes. So when we start looking back over here, this is a graphic going back to 2016 that is kind of showing you our growth in our property tax compared to our growth in our expenditures. Now you're going to see one item in 2018 that shows a 30% growth. That was great because we took advantage of some bank capacity that we had. Unfortunately, we don't have that luxury to take advantage of that any longer. We have used that. What you're seeing here, though, is a growth. The last 2 years, our property tax is coming in at just over 2%. If you start going back and excluding the banked capacity element of it, we're averaging about 2.25% increase in our property tax. But of course, it's more closer to 2 more years than not. So it's just something to be mindful of. But then if you look at the expenditures are growing. I mean, we did take the reductions in 2020, so you do see a reduced amount there. But for the most part, you do see growth, 5%, 10%, 9% in those expenditure lines. Sales tax at the Operations and Public Safety Committee meeting, we did talk about the sales tax. Sales tax has been pretty stable. At one point during the council retreat, we talked about the fact that we thought it might be slowing down. It has slowed down its rapid growth, but it's still pretty constant, so I feel pretty good there. The thing that we don't know is really what that's still going to look like as things begin to settle down, but I still feel pretty good about what we're seeing in our sales tax realm. So when we start then looking at the general fund forecast, what I want you to know is these numbers don't include any of the projections for any of the salaries and benefits. These numbers don't include some of these updates that are going to happen to our general fund, which we'll talk a little bit more about some of those. But what you're going to find is that the 2021, we do know that it's showing a 44% fund balance. That's kind of that same figure we were talking about earlier, just about. This is a little bit timing-wise, a little bit different than this last report. But still, you're seeing that we are using up some of that fund balance, just handling our operating items. And again, please remember that the effects of inflation are not in here, and neither are the negotiations with the contracts accounted for in here. Other things not accounted for in those numbers are insurance funds. I've mentioned before that we've talked a lot before about the insurance funds, particularly our liability and worker comp funds. Those ones are continuing to see rapid increases in expenditures and need for funding. Those insurance funds are funded by other funds of the city, so they're funded through allocations from all of the funds, but a good chunk of that funding comes from the general fund.
Paula,
yeah.
Councilmember Thomas has a question.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Could you go back one slide, Paula, please?
Sure.
So I was looking at beginning fund balance along the lines there, and you're dropping rapidly toward 24, 25, 26. And I'm just kind of curious to go from 45,000, 47 down to 27. So you're anticipating the beginning fund being spent. Is that basically?
This is based on our current position now, that we do anticipate that if we leave everything status quo and we look at where our revenues are coming in with the standard projection of growth and where our expenditures are coming in with their standard projection of growth, we are anticipating to run down this fund balance.
And that's not even including the inflation factor that you talked about.
Exactly.
So it's going to be, I mean, you've got to anticipate even less than that. So
True.
when we're doing our budget this fall, I mean, we've got to try to take all that into account.
Absolutely, and I actually have some ideas going into the 23-24 budget that I want to share with you guys. And so as soon as I walk you through, I'll talk to you a little bit about how I want to be able to try to address some of this eating into our fund balance so rapidly.
So would you say that you might even anticipate May and June being in the 9% inflation factor, or even possibly 10%?
I honestly, if I had a crystal ball and could project that.
I know. I am really concerned about the situation that we have in front of us. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I'm hoping as we get through here, I can maybe set your mind at ease just a little bit, but I kind of want to walk through all of the pieces. Yes, yes. All right, so we've talked about our insurance funds. And looking at our insurance funds, it's looking like that they are going to need some additional contributions into those funds as we move forward. Our fleet allocation, we're reviewing that right now, so we're going to be doing some updates and modification to our fleet allocation, and we don't know yet exactly what that's going to look like for our budget, but we are working on that. We do also have some other internal service funds that we're going to have to look at their budgets individually and then allocate out their costs to funds. And this would be things like our IT department, multimedia, facilities would fall into that category. And then the last item here that we still are having to work through is our internal cost allocations. Those are the cost allocations related to finance, HR, legal, and administration. They reside within the general fund, and we allocate out our support to other funds, to those other departments, and that they are based on the 2 years prior, the actuals from 2 years prior. So 2023 will be based on 2021 actuals. So those are things that we're still kind of sorting through to see what they'll end up looking like. And we all know that we have had a structural imbalance year after year after year. We had tried to address it with the 2020 budget reductions, and we thought we were very successful. But again, like I said, we were not expecting some of the challenges that we are facing today. And then when we met with council at the council retreat, there were some things, I did not write down everything that was talked about during that meeting, but just some of the highlights that I'm taking away with is the need for community engagement. So we're going to be doing some enhanced budget roadshows. throughout the community. We're beginning to work on all of that now. We want to make sure that we're preserving our core services that the city provides. We're not bringing forth the new initiatives or staffing, no new taxes or unplanned tax increases. And hey, we have some fund balance. We talked about that at our last meeting. We have some fund balance that could help us to be able to preserve some of these services as we're navigating through some of this. But one of the things that I want to talk a little bit about, and I'll go ahead and flip to this screen, is talking about our revenues. We've talked about the fact that 25% of our general fund revenue is property tax. And, you know, we can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars hiring a consultant and bring them in, and they're going to tell us that if our operating expenses, which are going to grow at the rate of inflation, if not more, if our operating expenses are going to grow at that rate and we're capped with this property tax, we're always going to have a problem. So somehow, I think it's important that we look to shift our reliance on our property tax. And if we then look at shifting our property tax, instead of having it all be in the general fund where it's supposed to be handling ongoing operating expenses, and we shift it to our capital program will still be funded. Our capital program will grow at the rate of our property tax, which is between 2 and 2.25% each and every year. But then what we could do is shift back some of the other tax revenue that is currently supporting our capital program and shift it to our general fund. These are things like sales tax, B&O tax, being able to shift those and also a majority of our utility taxes back to that general fund, and then take the property tax, put it in our capital program. We're now aligning ongoing expenses with more ongoing type revenues that are more aligned with the growth of inflation. So what is that going to mean? Well, so ultimately what that would end up looking like is we would take, instead of 100% of our property tax going into the general fund, we would have about half of it stay in the general fund while half of it goes to capital resources. We are working still on some of these percentage splits exactly, but I think we're 47.5% to 52.5% split seems to be about the right split. The other thing we would do is then take all of the sales tax and put it into the general fund. The internal utility tax, there are a couple of pieces of that internal utility tax that I believe we would probably want to keep where they're currently going. And that would include the utility tax that goes towards our youth teen program. And also there's a 4% of utility tax that goes towards some of our capital program, internal capital programming for streets that I think would make more sense to keep there. Because it's not necessarily, it's more operating in nature versus capital in nature. We would not change our REIT distribution. That would still obviously be for capital, since that's what those dollars would be for. Now, this is really hard to read. It still does not pick up all the inflationary impacts, because again, we don't really have good figures on those yet. But what you can see, the yellow, orangish, beigeish colored box at the top of the general fund, that would be what the general fund looks like now in that spend down of that fund balance. The more bluish colored, that would be what it would look like if we were able to shift those revenues. And the same goes with our capital program. We're still funding our capital program, and I'll be the first to admit that it'll be at a slower rate. However, the reality is that we have actually been seeing our REIT revenue grow at a much faster rate than we have even budgeted, and that has continued to roll into our fund balances. But by doing this, this does slow down the impact on the general fund's fund balance. It allows us to more appropriately absorb our ongoing costs without having to be faced with what types of reductions. And I believe this buys us time to be able to look at what other options do we have to be able to address this structural imbalance. And I think this is a first step in doing so. There will still be, you'll see in the capital resource fund, in the kind of the bluish greenish area, it talks about the forecast for capital projects. You'll see in 23-24 we do have larger balances there for capital because we're anticipating in 23-24 trying to spend down some of that fund balance that we have collected and work towards some of these projects that we have. In addition to that, the projects that were funded by B&O tax, they would be coming out of this capital projects fund, so we had to kind of add them into here because originally those B&O tax items were actually transfers out from the general fund to parks capital and to streets capital. So it would be coming out of here, still being able to provide funding to that, allowing them to grow at that same rate as the property tax. So if we were to do this, obviously there's pros and cons to doing something like this. One of the pros with this is that the majority of the revenue sources in the general fund, they're going to be more aligned with inflation. And it's going to help while doing this, we're still going to have a consistent stream of revenue to maintain our capital programming. Some of the cons is in times of a recession, property tax is one of our most stable revenue sources, so we might want to tap into this. So I think that when we start looking at that con, it's, okay, do we need to somehow write our ordinance in a way or our code in a way that we could tap into that should we need to in a time of decline? The other thing is it does slow down our capital programming because it's not going to grow at that same exponential rate that maybe the sales taxes and the B&O taxes have been growing because it will have that capped capacity. So in order to achieve this, we will need to look at looking at our code, so writing some ordinances that would update our sales tax, property tax, B&O tax, and utility tax ordinances in order to ensure that the council's intent for those revenues are still being met. So the council had passed ordinances intending for sales tax and utility tax to be used towards our capital program. We want to make sure that we are earmarking those dollars through the ordinance to still align with that, to use the property tax dollars instead. So those would have to be done in order to kind of have that go through. But the intent with all of this is to still keep with the council's overall intent for revenue streams within the city. It'll just be a different bucket of money versus the original sales tax and utility taxes. So when we start, now this is going on to the budget timeline, so I'll be happy to take questions about kind of this proposal that's in front of you. But just really quick, we are getting ready to do our budget kickoff. That's going to happen next week. And this budget kickoff, this is going to be a status quo budget. We don't want to make reductions. We do have fund balance. I'd like to include this proposal to shift this use of revenue to be able to reduce the use of property tax in the general fund, or reliance on that, and use some of those other taxes instead and shift part of that property tax to capital resources. Whatever still doesn't get covered by all of this switch, we do have the fund balance that we do would like to tap into for this budget process. And then our goal is to get the mayor's proposed budget to you on September 20th, and then followed by a series of budget workshops in September and October, hoping for adoption by the council on November 15th. Now, I'd be happy to answer any questions you guys have.
Thank you so much for this presentation, Paula. You've given us a lot to think about. Are there any questions or comments from my fellow council members? Okay.
Can I?
Oh, sorry. Councilmember Trapner.
I just want to say thank you, Paula, for giving us this first look at it. I really do like what we have before us because I think all of those things make sense. So I'm just looking forward to the discussion as we move forward.
Thank you. And Council President Boyce wasn't able to be here tonight to hear this, but I did have an opportunity to have a conversation with him, about him as well, and he was very supportive of this path forward as well.
Paula, I have a question about property tax. We've been hearing that property taxes are going up just because of the valuation of homes is going up. Does that positively impact Kent?
Unfortunately, property taxes do go up. Unfortunately, what we get to collect in Kent is still limited by 1% plus new construction. And so that dollar amount is all we get to collect, and then what they do is they spread it out over our residential and our commercial. So sometimes commercial might take on more of it and residential, but ultimately the city does not benefit from any increased taxes. We are still locked into that limitation.
Any other questions or comments? All right, thanks so much.
All right, thank you.
Okay, and that concludes our workshop. We will be back here at 7 for our council meeting.